So here it is, the moment we've been waiting for, the message from our very own Mark Pomeroy. Don't forget, guys, we're going to do a communion at the end of the message, so grab your bread and wine before we get started.
Well, hey there, Elevate friends and family. Great to have you with us today as we continue our series, How We Fight Our Battles. Now, when you think of instantly recognized images, what comes to mind? You might think of brands like these three, which don't have any words, but I'm pretty confident you know what they are. Maybe images of cities or of icons within cities. Immediately you can recognize that city that it's located in because they've become just so ubiquitous and we're familiar with them. Even symbols that are kind of, across different spheres like this one, and yes, Wi-Fi. But if you were to ask the internet, what is the most recognized symbol in the world, you'll discover that many results, many articles will tell you it's the cross. The cross, which you'll see on church buildings, you see in cemeteries, you see it used as jewelry, people getting tattoos of the cross, you might see it on bumper stickers of the cross. And once upon a time, it would have seemed quite absurd to use a cross to symbolize something positive, because the cross initially and for many centuries was simply a tool for torture and capital punishment. And so it's almost like wearing a guillotine around your neck as some sort of positive statement. But the meaning of the cross turned 180 degrees as the result of one individual who was one of tens of thousands of people who was put to death on the cross. And today, some 2,000 years later, the cross has gone from a symbol of torture and death to become the preeminent symbol of love. So, as I mentioned, we've been in this series, How We Fight Our Battles. This is the 5th week, and it's been fantastic. The feedback we're getting is brilliant. Make sure you catch up if you've missed any of the episodes. What I want to talk about today, and each week we've taken one of the tools that God gives us access to fight our battles. I want to talk today about remembrance and how important it is to remember what Jesus went through on the cross. And not just what he went through as if it's some sort of historical case study in pain and torture, but also to come out of today with a greater appreciation of what his sacrifice has made possible for you and for me, for people who put their faith in Jesus. Big brain Bible preacher, Scottish man named Oswald Sanders in the late 1800s. He wrote this: "All heaven is interested in the cross of Christ, all hell terribly afraid of it, while men or people are the only beings who more or less ignore its meaning." And so I really want us to unpack its meaning today. How God took Jesus' suffering and transformed it into a miracle, and ultimately get a clearer perspective on how the suffering that Jesus went through amplifies the magnitude of the miracle. So Jesus was killed by being hung on a cross by the Roman government, the Roman army, the Roman soldiers, which is a form, in fact, it was the worst form of killing, what's been known as crucifixion. And the Romans had perfected the whole process. around crucifixion, had it so dialed in so as to extract maximum pain and suffering for the people that were put to death. And it wasn't simply for the purpose of the pain and suffering. It was beyond that. It was to send a message to everyone in the Roman Empire. Stay in line. And if you don't, this might be your fate. Now, hanging Jesus on a cross wasn't enough for the people who were charged with that responsibility. In fact, they put him through unimaginable humiliation and pain and torture. They wanted to weaken him before they eventually hung him. So they took a whip that would have looked something like this. It was leather, but it also had bits of bone and metal and rocks woven into it. So it didn't just inflict pain as it was whipped on the skin, that it would actually rip off pieces of flesh and muscle. And he was whipped 40 times. And the reason that number matters is that most people didn't survive that many lashes of the whip. It was quite common for people to die far earlier, or something in the 30s, and yet Jesus, whilst weakened, he survived the 40. And so they didn't stop there. They went about, this is the Roman soldiers, and the people gathered there, they went about spitting on him, mocking him, punching him in the face, beating him with a reed pole. They put a crown of thorns on his head, which was mocking him because he, claimed to be the king of the Jews, or he was accused of that. And so there was this crown, but made of thorns to inflict more pain and loss of blood, more humiliation. And in fact, the soldiers kept on mocking him until the soldiers got tired of it. Not when Jesus got tired, but when they got tired, that's when they eventually stopped. And then they strapped the horizontal beam of the cross around Jesus' shoulders. And this beam would have been, here's a cinema depiction. It would have been approximately 2 meters long and approximately 40 kilograms in weight, which would be challenging if you're at full strength, let alone what Jesus had been through up to this point. And then once the person got to the place where the vertical pole and the ultimate place where they were going to be killed, the soldiers would drive nails through their hands or wrists and through their feet. And even then, they weren't just placed to hold the individual up on the cross. They were placed and hammered in to inflict maximum pain again, where there was nerve endings and so on. And then eventually and ultimately, Jesus was hung on the cross. And on that day, Friday, between 9 a.m. and 3 p.m., Jesus hung naked on a cross. And during those 6 hours, he made 7 profound statements. And so that's what I want us to drill into today, what he said and why it matters. So you can get your smartphone and open the camera app and scan this flow code, and it's going to take you to the first of the things that Jesus said, and these were recorded by Luke, who actually wasn't one of Jesus' handpicked followers. He started following Jesus later, and he went about interviewing eyewitnesses. And so he recorded from the eyewitness accounts some of the 7 things that Jesus said, starting with this one. When he was hung on the cross, he said, after going through this unimaginable torture, "Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they're doing. Forgive them. I mean, this would have been shocking and surprising to the people gathered there then. And look, I think it's fair for any of us to find the idea shocking. Again, because after all that he'd been through, and him knowing that he was about to die, there was no turning back, there was no plan B. Instead of calling down the angels to get them, this kind of revenge move, and you understand it. You've prayed for God to send a drone strike to someone that cut you off in traffic, and yet Jesus was exactly the opposite. Father, forgive them. And it reveals the very heart of Jesus and the very heart of the Father. No matter what we've done, no matter how far we've failed, no matter how we've missed it in terms of God's holy standard, if we go to him, he's ready and willing to forgive. Now, the second thing that Jesus said, so he was crucified on this cross between two others. So there was actually three men being killed on three separate crosses on that day. Jesus in the middle, and on either side were two thieves. And one of the thieves, he joined in the mocking. He said to Jesus, hey, listen, if you really are who you say you are, why don't you save yourself? Get yourself down off the cross. Oh, and by the way, while you're at it, how about you save us as well? Cynical, sarcastic. And the other thief essentially says to him, hey, mate, shut up. Like, we're here in this situation because we deserve it. We did the crime and this is our punishment, but this man did no wrong. And then he turned to Jesus and he said, hey, listen, can you remember me when you come into your kingdom? And Jesus replied to him, I assure you, today you'll be with me in paradise. This goes against the religion of the day, because the religion of the day, the Jewish religion of the day, very much hinged on getting right with God through what you did right. And if you did wrong, you had to do works and sacrifices and so on in order to get back to being right with God. And yet this man, this thief, he had nothing to offer Jesus. He couldn't walk back any of the crimes he'd done. He couldn't offer any sacrifices. He couldn't get to the temple. He couldn't do anything except open his heart to Jesus. And Jesus welcomed him into his kingdom. It's a powerful reminder that no matter how far you've fallen, no matter how dramatically you've failed, Jesus' forgiveness is available to you. Now, there weren't just mockers in attendance and Roman army in attendance. I mean, sadly, most of Jesus' followers at this point had abandoned him, or they were in hiding for fear of their lives that they might be next. Yet there were a few of Jesus' family and friends that did stay with him and were camped out at the foot of the cross, no doubt heartbroken, and also no doubt wanting to be with him in his greatest time of suffering. Mary, his mother, was one of them. This is Mary who, as a teenager, had an angel appear to her and say, you're going to give birth to the Savior of the world. Mary, who raised Jesus as his earthly mother, and now 33 and a half years later is watching him being killed on a cross. Another one of the people gathered there was John. He was one of Jesus' handpicked followers and ultimately became kind of like Jesus' closest of his handpicked followers. And Jesus said to them, "Dear woman," to Mary, "here is your son," which he wasn't biologically, and then he said to John, this disciple, "Here is your mother." And it's a reminder that even while Jesus was in his worst phase of suffering, he was still thinking of other people. He was still thinking of those he loved and cared for. And he's thinking of you and me always. We can't forget that. Then he said something maybe on the surface that sounds a little surprising. He said, the fourth thing he said is, my God, why have you abandoned me? Which maybe you can relate. Maybe you, in some state of suffering, or you've prayed that. That's a pretty honest prayer to pray. And you've maybe prayed that to God. And God's big enough to handle it. Yet to think that the Son of God is now questioning the faithfulness of his Father is to actually miss what is really going on here. In fact, what Jesus is doing in this moment is he's actually quoting the opening of Psalm 22. Psalm 22 is just before the famous Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. It's also written by David, King David. And it starts with this line, my God, why have you abandoned me? And David goes on to record this process of someone being crucified. Like he was sort of saying it about himself, that he was being hunted and punished. But actually the picture that he writes in Psalm 22 is that of somebody who's had nails driven through their hands, who's been crucified in a time where nobody was being crucified. Crucifixion wasn't even a thing when David wrote this. And so David was very much looking into the future. And Jesus was in this moment confirming that what God had spoken and shown to David and spoken through David centuries before, that he was now fulfilling that he was now doing the thing that God called him to do. And his followers would have known that. They would have been familiar with the Psalms, the songbook of Israel. And he was assuring them that he, in this moment, when it looked like he was being defeated, was actually very intentionally carrying out God's plan. And then Jesus said something that seemingly requires no explanation. I am thirsty. Yeah, I no surprise there. And then we see what appeared to be, on the surface, the first act of compassion that someone had demonstrated. Somebody actually grabbed a sponge that was soaking in a liquid and put that on a stick and held it up to Jesus' mouth. The problem is that the sponge was soaked in sour wine or vinegar. And there's Jesus with open cuts and wounds. And it's the worst thing that you could have exposed him to. And so again, Jesus, the mocking continued. But Jesus, that wasn't the point of him saying he's thirsty. He was saying, I'm thirsty. I'm in this place. I've intentionally allowed God to lead me to this place. And I am going through thirst so that you will never have to. And then the sixth thing that Jesus said is, it is finished, which points, yes, to the idea that this is nearing the end, but he actually used a phrase which was actually just one word, which we translate, it is finished. But this word, it was a word that was used if you owed somebody money and you've been paying them off. When you paid the final installment, they would actually write this word on the note, on the document. It is finished. It's been paid in full. You don't owe me anything. And Jesus is setting this up to boldly declare that he's paid the price for our sins, that we owe God, because of our sin, we've owed God a debt that we can't repay. And Jesus paid it for us. And so he's stamping our account in this moment. For those of us that have put our faith in him, that have asked for his forgiveness, he's stamping our account finished, complete, paid in full. And then finally he said, Father, I entrust my spirit into your hands. This idea that I've done what you sent me to do, and now I'm coming back home. So what I want us to do right now, and Tom's given you the heads up at the top, grab the cracker and the juice or the liquid, whatever you've got, and we're going to take communion together. And so I've got just a piece of cracker, and this is something that Jesus instructed us to do, and that we would actually in this moment use this as a symbol of his body, that when we eat this, which we will do in a moment, we just remember that Jesus offered up his body as a sacrifice for us. So how about you take that bread or that cracker right now? And then in his time, they would have had wine at the table. I've just got water here. Whatever, liquid beverage that you have, Jesus instructed us to use this as a symbol of his blood that was poured out for you and me. But ultimately was living water. Ultimately, he thirsted so we'll never have to. And just to remember that. Remember not just the magnitude of the miracle, but what it made possible for you and me and makes possible for you and me. And then I'm going to pray. Jesus, we thank you that you went through this not as a victim, but as a victor, that you conquered sin and you conquered death, and you've made it possible for all of us who put our faith in you to live as victors as well, to know that whilst we fight battles, we don't fight them alone. We don't fight them from a place of defeat. We fight them from a place of victory that you won by what you did, by dying on the cross and then rising again from the dead. We thank you in your name. Amen.